Good afternoon. My name is Mariana Prado. I teach at the University of Toronto, and I'm originally from Brazil. I have no advice for the G20, and I'm here as a scholar to propose that we use a brand new concept to analyze some of the recent developments that have been happening in global governance. And this concept is called institutional bypass. So before I get to explain how this is relevant to all the topics we have been talking about here, let me just explain to you how I got to this concept. So there is a lot of talk in the development agenda about good governance and institutional reform, and there seems to be a consensus that institutions matter for development. Basically, I came to this topic after analyzing over and over the reasons for failures in trying to promote this kind of institutional reforms in developing countries. So an institutional bypass basically is the idea that we're trying to fix dysfunctional institutions when we maybe should not. We should be doing something else. So let's think of the word bypass and how it's used in some contexts. If you're in the medical field, what is a coronary bypass surgery? You have a clogged, blocked artery in the heart, and instead of trying to fix that clogged, blocked artery, you basically go around it. And you create a new pathway for the blood flow. You take an artery from another part of the blood, you plug into the heart, and your heart is pumping blood normally. Similarly, in the road context, basically when we talk about a bypass route, is a route that allows you to not have to go through a city and reduce your speed, but instead you go around it and you continue at a high speed to reach your destination at an earlier point of time. So the alternate route would allow you an alternative pathway, but doesn't allow you to go as fast because you're still going through the city, whereas the bypass route goes around the city. So going back to the attempt to promote institutional reforms for development, what is it that we have been trying to do? We have people in developing countries. These people have a number of different needs. We're trying to attend to those needs with institutions that perform all kinds of services and functions that are quite important and instrumental to achieve all sorts of development goals. But some of these institutions don't work. My proposal here is, instead of trying to make this dysfunctional institution work, why we're not just creating parallel institutions that perform exactly the same function, and suddenly the people who are demanding the services have an option. They can go to the old institution, they can go to the new one, depending on which one performs the best service. So this is the concept of bypass. I have written about it. These are the characteristics of a bypass. It needs to keep the pre-existing institution in place. It creates an alternative pathway, so now citizens have a choice. And the third is that it tries to be more efficient or functional than the pre-existing institution. Once you have this concept in hand, it's almost like having a hammer and everything becomes a nail. So being from Brazil, the first place I started looking for bypasses was my home country, and I found Poupa Tempo, which is a bureaucratic reform implemented in the country that is actually a bypass of dysfunctional bureaucratic services, trying to get your driver's license, your identity card, trying to fix that, failed. The government created a parallel institution to perform those services. UPPs, the police pacifying units in Rio de Janeiro, I have analyzed that and described that as an attempt to bypass the state police in the state of Rio de Janeiro after multiple attempts to reform that state police. And right now I'm trying to analyze how private security and private schools would fall in the same concept. So after this long-winded introduction, here we get to the core of the relevance for this concept to what we're talking about here today. Steve Hoffman and Jürgen Hottingen have suggested in a paper that bypasses are potentially applicable and quite useful in the global governance context as well. So although my research has been thus far mostly focused on the domestic context, there is a question about whether we could use it productively to analyze what has happened in the global sphere. Some potential examples of international institutional bypasses would be the Global Fund for AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis as a bypass of the World Health Organization, the WTO being bypassed now by the regional trade agreements, and the WIPO being bypassed by the TRIPS in the context of the WTO. But most relevantly for this group, I'm going to skip this, is whether the new development bank, also known as the BRICS Bank, is actually a bypass of the traditional multilateral lending institutions, especially the World Bank. And again, within the same context, we could be asking whether the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is an example of an institutional bypass of the same lending institutions. So in order to ask this question, I do not have an answer, but I have a few things that I think might be relevant and interesting in helping us analyzing whether these two new development banks are bypasses of the existing multilateral financing institutions. First is the political dimension. What are the drives and the motivations behind the creation of these new banks? Meaning, are they trying to bypass these old institutions? Second is the institutional dimension. And here we are not only talking about what the leadership had in mind when they created these new institutions, but actually we're looking inside these new banks and asking whether the governance structures that determine how the leaders play with each other and the political dynamics inside the institution and decision making determines the outcomes. So here, in the institutional dimension, it becomes quite interesting because the governance structure of the new development bank is very, very different from the governance structure of the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. One is very, very much focused on the BRICS, whereas the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is more open to Western donors. So there is sort of a more interactive arrangement in the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, whereas there is a much more closed arrangement in the new development bank. And the third dimension I'm calling the economic dimension, and what do I mean by that is sheerly demand and supply. There is demand for development financing, and the question here is whether these new banks are providing new products, and whether these new products are actually going to be better than the products that are out there in the market today, meaning the World Bank, what the World Bank is offering. So here we could be looking, for instance, at the fact that the conditionalities of the World Bank not only have been heavily criticized, but have been questioned in their effectiveness. And the economic dimension of the new development bank and the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank could allow us to look at whether not imposing the same conditionalities or not imposing conditionalities at all will change the dynamic of this interaction. So, and this is, again, I don't have advice to any leaders, but I do have a few things that scholars in the room could be looking at. Intentionality. Did the leaders who create these institutions were trying to bypass the existing development financing organizations? And of course, we're not going to find this on the official statements on the website of the new development bank, right? So this would require a little bit more digging and working in terms of assessing the real intentions behind the public official statements that we have access to. Second, looking not only at the formal governance structures, but also informally how they operate and how they play out. So this is going to be quite interesting once these banks start to operate and actually have been operating for a period of time, because it's going to be hard to determine that in advance. And the third aspect is product innovation. And again, here, I think literally what I'm suggesting we should be looking at is how these loans are going to be structured and whether they're going to be structured in ways that are way more interesting to developing countries and therefore would have a lot more uptake than the traditional lending that has been happening previously with the World Bank and IMF. So this is what I have for today. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.